take 3. This is the 3rd time recording this. Nature versus nurture, a brief history of the nature argument. Right, for your assignment, you need to explain 3 key arguments for the nature argument, evaluate those arguments, and explain the interactions. In the next video, I'll go over the nurture argument. Alright, so hopefully this video, get a pen and paper, you'll be able to explain and evaluate the key arguments of the nature side of the argument, and use your studies and theories and explain how behavior is nature via nurture, and that's the interactions. If you can remember the contents of this video, you're on track to get excellence. Look, this is what you will need for excellence. Evaluate the key arguments, all right? Show the interactions and use studies and theories, all right? And also you'll need to show how that, just to get achieved, you'll need to show how they've changed over time. And we're going to look at that in this video, okay? So hopefully, okay, pay attention, get a pen and paper, you'll have everything you need. So the key question here, right, is behavior nature or nurture? We talked about this with criminology. Are people aggressive? Do they wind up in prison because it's in their nature? These are the internal biological factors, or is it in the nurture, the way they were brought up? So the nature arguments, we'll break it down into 3 key things, right? Remember, the fundamental argument on the nature side of the debate is that our behavior is a product of our genetics, our brain, and our chemical messengers, these internal physiological qualities that we have. So first of all, let's look at the genetic side of the argument. Now, I think it's important we begin with this guy, Francis Galton, back in 1875. He was the person who coined the term nature versus nurture in the first published article of twin studies. Right? So he was the first one to conduct a twin study, and he was out to prove a point that behavior and who we are is a product of our nature. It's just in our genetics. People are either born superior or inferior. And there's a whole bunch of controversy about his research. You can read more about it here. The link you can find on the Schoolbox with this link. These slides are on Schoolbox, and the hyperlink there will take you to more information about his studies. But just important to know that he conducted the first study out to prove the point that our behavior was nature, but his methodology was pretty questionable. He sent out questionnaires, he kind of cherry-picked the data, he didn't really follow the scientific approach. Now, for what it's worth, Galton was a distant cousin of Darwin, and he was influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, which is also possibly where we could begin our exploration of the nature debate. Anyway, but talking about genetics, it begins with the nature-nurture debate and his first twin study. And then the study of twins really progresses throughout the 1900s. In 1922, we have the first study using monozygotic and dizygotic twins. Monozygotic means identical, like these lads, and dizygotic means fraternal. I guess they're identical. Yeah, they wouldn't be fraternal twins, they'd be identical. Yeah. And so then this wasn't really a psychological study, but it was important because it identifies monozygotic and dizygotic. These guys have 100% of the DNA in common. These guys have 50%. And so often twin studies will compare these two. 1970s, the most famous twin study, the Minnesota twin study, begins, and that tracks thousands of twins over a number of years. Most famously studied and published about IQ. All right. But important for our research on aggression, Raynham Baker's study in 2011 looked at antisocial behavior, and that information's there on the textbook, and you can look it up as well. But essentially what they found was that antisocial behavior in adolescents and young people was around 50%, meaning that it was attributed to 50% of their genetic makeup. Okay, but we look at, these are twin studies that support the nature side of the argument that definitely genetics plays a part, all right? But we'll talk about the limitations of this in supporting the nature side of the argument in a little moment. Now, interaction is epigenetics. This is a very recent field of study, which is the interaction between genes and the environment. And hopefully you'll recognize this graph from our studies of criminology. This is from the Dunedin longitudinal study by Caspi et al., and this was published in 2002. This is showing the interaction between the childhood maltreatment down here and the type of genetic variant you have of the MAOA gene. All right, so what this is showing is that, look, down here, child maltreatment, if both groups have no maltreatment, their antisocial behavior is about the same. This does not support the nature side of the argument. All right, if behavior was nature, well then we would expect the L variant, this black graph, to be up here and the grey one to be down here because the environment shouldn't have an effect. However, it shows that even with different genetics, their antisocial behavior is about the same. Right? However, if you take the L variant and couple it with childhood maltreatment, that means abuse or neglect, antisocial behavior is far higher in the MAOA-L variant than the MAOA-H variant. So this does two things. One, highlights a limitation of the genetic argument, right? Because it's showing that environment is a real important factor to consider. Epigenetics is highlighting that it's possibly not just genetics, it's genes plus environment. And this is demonstrating an interaction. Feel free to try to remember and memorize this graph or a simplified version of it. If you can diagram that in your essay or, actually, no, I know you're doing it on the computer, aren't you? That's pretty tricky. Anyway, okay, sorry. You can summarize it. Okay, but this is important because it's showing the interaction and its genes and the environment. So that is showing a bit of a change, how the debates changed over time, right? From 1875, where Galton tried to argue that it was nature, to now the modern day, where we know through epigenetic studies it's nature via nurture. Now, the brain, important. We begin with localization. Remember, all these different parts of the brain perform a different function, right? Some of them do movement, language, speech, emotion. Okay, that's localization. And we first discovered this in early case studies in the 1800s. Now, the idea could be tracked back to phrenology, but this was largely discredited. It was a pseudoscience. It was suggesting bumps on the head related to our temperament. But the early case studies of the 1800s demonstrated this idea. Okay, so remember TAN, the guy could only say TAN, that was discovered in Broca's area. It's a specific area of the brain here. So we did that, Broca did the autopsy on TAN and found that he had a lesion, had damage to that part of the brain. All right, so we know that part of the brain is responsible for speech. And then Phineas Gage, right, damaged his frontal lobe, and that changed his personality and also made him more impulsive. So first case study there suggests maybe damage to our brain and the frontal lobe, first study to suggest that our frontal lobe regulates our behavior. And also maybe HM had his hippocampus removed, and that's another case study. So really important case studies on individual men from 1800s, 1850s, and HM from 1957, showing localization of function. And then later animal studies, so Weisskranz in 1957, I believe, removed the amygdala from rhesus macaque monkeys and found that they became really tame. And so, again, further animal studies suggesting that different parts of the brain perform different functions. In this one, it was the amygdala and emotion. Now, we know from a big development in our brain imaging studies and our understanding of localization comes from fMRI. So now we can put people in fMRI and measure the different parts of their brain that are active at different times. So this supports that argument that different parts of the brain or our behavior is a product of activity in different parts of the brain. Okay? Right, yeah, so if our amygdala will light up when we see aggressive faces. Now, the interaction, however, is to do with neuroplasticity. Remember, the brain's ability to change as a result of experience. And one of the first experiments on this was Rosenzweig and Bennett. So you should be able to describe this study, right? You put rats in an impoverished, deprived environment. Their brain cells won't develop as much as if you put them in an enriched environment with toys, other rats, maze training, larger space. Their frontal lobes will be heavier. They'll develop more synaptic connections, so we see more branching and more acetylcholine receptors. Right? So this is one of the first studies that discredited that idea that our brain was fixed. Before these studies, psychologists thought, our brain pretty much stops developing after about 3 or 4 years old. However, Rosenzweig and Bennett highlights that actually our brain is not the product of our genetics. It is actually, our brain development can be influenced through our environment. Neuroplasticity. Okay. Now, more modern research using fMRI and MRI studies, right, have supported that. Okay. So remember, we can't do these experiments on humans, but with the invention of the MRI in 1977 and the fMRI in 1990, now we can study this. So we know McCrory, if you have lots of ACEs as a kid, your amygdala is going to become hyper-responsive. Maguire's study on bus drivers and taxi drivers, right? If you become a taxi driver, your hippocampus is going to change shape because of how much you have to remember. And Drugansky using motor skills, right? Different parts of your brain and your motor cortex are going to become more active and more developed if you practice a physical skill. And, what have I done there? I clicked the hyperlink, so I shouldn't have done that. This is an annoying slideshow. There we go. Okay, right. And we are back to, right. And then there's the Romanian orphan study. And so this is like a natural experiment similar to Rosenvig and Bennett's, where if you take these young kids who have been naturally grown up in a deprived environment and you do an MRI, you'll see that their brains are different, about 8% smaller. Their brains are, these kids, than regular controls due to their environment. And we can understand that now, this neuroplasticity, through the use of MRIs. Okay, so that's a key way. Neuroplasticity does two things. It shows the interaction, right, which is, and that interaction has been shown through the recent development of technology. So that's how the argument has changed over time, because of developments of technology. Also, again, highlights the limitations of saying our behavior is caused by brain function, right? It's not. Our brain function is influenced by our environment. We get to the third point here. Now, if you've explained the first two in enough detail, then you might not need this third argument, but I suggest touching on either hormones or neurotransmitters. And so we can just briefly, you can mention Berthold's roosters from back in the day. They castrated one group, they became a capon, right? Or if they castrated and reimplanted, or castrated and transplanted from a different rooster, right? We get normal male development, suggesting that the testosterone plays a role in development of of masculine features and also aggression. Albert et al. Study we've looked at from 1986. We did that in criminology with the castration of the rats, which influenced their aggression levels. And then more recent research, and some of you wrote about this in your assignments, Goetz's study, or Radke's study, where we give participants testosterone and put them in fMRI, make them look at aggressive or threatening faces, and we see more activity in their amygdala, suggesting that, right, testosterone influences aggression because it boosts activity in our amygdala. And so that's, again, furthering our understanding of that. Neurotransmitters, antidepressants, accidentally discovered in the 1950s, which led to the monoamine hypothesis, which is the suggestion that, I should have changed the image. The suggestion that depression is a product of chemical imbalance, right? And we could look at more modern studies like 2012 Passamoni's research, suggesting that serotonin influences the brain. So serotonin, lack of serotonin, will influence our prefrontal cortex and amygdala activity when we're viewing aggressive faces. Right? That's Passamoni's. So hormones or neurotransmitters, probably we focused more on hormones, so that could be a good one to talk about. Now, interactions here when talking about hormones, well, these are just some of the factors that can influence the levels of hormones in our body, the amount of sleep we get, what type of food we eat, how much exercise we get. And social interactions are a huge influence on our hormone levels. So physical contact can influence your oxytocin. Competition will influence your testosterone, right? Cooperation will also influence your hormone levels. So hormones don't just operate in a vacuum. They change as a result of environmental forces, and this suggests interactions. Okay, so the summary of the nature argument is, right, our behavior is a product of our genes, our brain, and our chemical messengers. However, all of those things can be influenced by our environment. Okay, and that's a key thing you need to get across. So first of all, you're explaining, yes, here's the nature argument. This is what the nature side of the argument believes. All right. However, our modern understanding is that it's nature via nurture. The nurture is influencing our nature. Now, if you're aiming for excellence, you'll need to evaluate these arguments. So I'm not going to give you all the points here because this has to be your critical thinking, but I'm going to guide you to some more resources so you can prepare to write some evaluations and explain really the limitations of the nature argument. The strengths of the nature argument would be the supporting evidence that demonstrates it, which you've already explained. So you really want to highlight the limitations. Twin studies, Rain and Baker, show antisocial behavior is 50% genetic. Now, that supports the genes argument, but it also highlights the limitation of saying that behavior is a product of nature. Can you see that? Hopefully you can see it by saying it's 50% genetic. That's highlighting a pretty key limitation of saying that our behavior is a product of our genes. Hopefully, a bit of thinking there, you'll be able to see the answer. The localization case studies, these are all based on one person and one man from 150 years ago. So think Phineas Gage, Tan, HM, individual men. So we're going to, the term here is generalizability. Can we say that all of our Broca's areas are the same? All of our hippocampi are the same? All of our frontal lobes are the same? What about the methodology they used from 150 years ago? Can we trust Phineas Gage's results, right? Was it really conducted scientifically? Is the data valid? Broca's area, Broca's research, right? This was an autopsy, and again, done a very long time ago. Okay, so is there limitations to these case studies? Now, here is an example essay. If you scroll to the bottom of that essay, you might see some example evaluations of those of similar studies and methodologies. Now, localization relies heavily on animal studies. Okay, so really, we're evaluating the nature argument and looking at the studies that support it. Would we, similar to generalizability based on one person, can we generalize these results to humans based on animals? Right? Yeah, sure. You can castrate a rat, and they'll get more aggressive. They'll get less aggressive, or we inject them with testosterone, they get more aggressive. But would the same apply for humans? Why not? And then this article here gives you some possible reasons why we might not be able to generalize our results from animals into for humans. Okay. Now, again, you've got 3 key points here to evaluate, and feel free, right? You're probably more likely to get to score higher marks and to get the excellence if you can come up with your own evaluative points as well. I'd love to read some of your unique and your deep thinking about limitations to the nature argument. Be wary, right, of Googling and finding other sources though and passing them off as your own. So now you must explain your evaluative points. Don't just say animal studies are limited because they can't be generalized, full stop. Okay, that's not a limitation. You need to explain why. Why might these results not be generalizable? Okay. Now, another key limitation that you should also be able to get from here is how the interactions that I've demonstrated with neuroplasticity, epigenetics, and environmental forces on our chemical messengers, they all highlight reductionism. And reduction means reducing an argument down to a single factor. Can the nature argument, hopefully you've seen from these interactions of neuroplasticity, of epigenetics, that we can't boil down complex human behavior to simply saying it's in our nature. Neuroplasticity highlights the limitation of focusing on just the brain. Epigenetics highlights the limitation of focusing on just genetics. So those interactions themselves highlight the reductionist nature of the nature argument. All right. So some tips for your essay. Number 1, you are doing this in a timed response. There's a lot of information here, and so plan ahead of time. Start planning now. You can write down how you're going to structure your argument so it makes sense, so it's logical and you cover everything you need to. 3 arguments, right? Genetics, brain, chemicals. Okay. Have 2 studies, and really you want to make 2 points, so one old and one new. I tried to give you an old study and a new study to show how the argument has changed over time, all right, from where it was then to where it is now, and the interactions also do that. And you can show how the argument's changed by focusing on new findings like Rosenfeld and Bennett's with neuroplasticity, the Dunedin study with epigenetics, new technology, how the MRI allows us to study neuroplasticity, and new methods, right? So how the twin studies and using MZ and DZ twins it's allowed us to see, hey, it's a bit of both nature and nurture, all right? And then the interactions here. And again, I've tried to give you the terminology to latch onto: neuroplasticity and epigenetics, 2 key things to explain. All right? And you'll need to evaluate again if you're aiming for excellence. So, good luck. I hope that helps. Now, watch that, pen and paper, take notes, plan, prepare. There's nothing stopping you from writing a practice essay ahead of time and getting some feedback. Good luck.